Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I thought I would chat with you guys a little bit about something that came through my social media feed, and I thought it was pretty interesting because it's a lot of the stuff that I point out to everyone. And it's kind of an update that Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, that many people call Dr. Gaines, made about how his views have changed over the past decade regarding muscle growth. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skilling at my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. Because, yeah, this is pretty interesting stuff because, again, Dr. Brad, and I don't always agree with everything he says. I believe he has his own set of bias in what he does. And that's fine. That's normal, and that's not even considered to be an insult for researchers. Researchers accept that stuff. And I'm not going to get into what I think those biases are. It's not really relevant to this conversation. But what's relevant is that, he hit a few different points about, what he believed like a decade ago versus what he believes today, based upon the research, the evidence, all the studies he's done and conducted, like looking at muscle growth in humans. And the first one was like the topic of rep range, like rep ranges. And he put, his previous belief is that muscle growth is best obtained by using moderate reps, like 6 to 12 rep max, meaning a weight that's your 6 to 12 rep max. That's usually where your most muscle growth occurs. And that's oftentimes still touted by people to be the hypertrophy rep range, although they'll call it like the 8 to 12. Now, his current opinion, and this is based on studies that he's done himself, hypertrophy can be obtained across a wide spectrum of loading zones. There is no ideal hypertrophy rep range per se, which is true. I mean, we've got good data now showing that you can get jacked off of 3 rep sets. You can stimulate maximum growth off 3 rep sets. You can stimulate maximum growth off 20 rep sets. There is no ideal rep range. And in fact, when people say this you need all the rep ranges to get everything available, that's not even true. Let's make that clear again. Maximum growth can be hit with triples. It can be reached with triples. It can be reached with 20 rep sets. No, you do not actually have to do all the rep ranges to see maximum growth. All right, that is pretty much understood. The other is just people trying to just sound trendy and to use everything because they see stuff saying, hey, X, Y, and Z can all work, so you have to use X, Y, and Z. No, you can just use X. Next was rest interval, and this was a great one. This is one of the pivotal ones. He originally believed short rest intervals, 60 seconds, are best for hypertrophy. All right, that's what people still tout that. He's done studies showing more muscle growth with longer breaks. In other words, more growth. So his current belief, longer rest intervals, 2 minutes or more, appear to be at least as beneficial, if not more so, for hypertrophy, particularly for multi-joint exercises. Well, you guys know my opinion on that multi-joint exercises have the best potential growth anyways. I believe that the majority of people, without a specialized reason, don't need to try to isolate muscles or do single joint exercises. And I'm not saying they don't have their place. I am going to say, though, that for a lot of people out there, they're not an efficient use of your time. You may not ever actually benefit from doing them, depending upon where you're at in your training. I'm not saying they don't have their place, because they do, but I don't think everyone needs them. But for example, I don't need any right now. I don't do any. So, interesting, because it kind of comes back to that point. We know longer breaks, based on his data, does seem to have a slight advantage for muscle growth. It's a slight advantage. Why? Because it allows more tonnage to be lifted on the same number of sets. You can do more work. In other words, that extra recovery allows you to get more work done, and workload is critical. Workload density doesn't really seem to matter like we thought it does. In other words, if you can do the same amount of work in less time, it doesn't seem to actually stimulate muscle growth, because you could have done more work by spacing the breaks out more, and you would have got more growth. So there's no real benefit there. It's wasteful. His next one was training frequency. He used to think a bro split is needed for maximum growth, right? His current opinion. When volume is equated, there is no advantage to using bro splits. Let me say that. When volume is equated, there is no advantage to using bro splits. Moreover, there seems to be a hypertrophic benefit for training muscle groups at least twice weekly. So in other words, no matter how you split things up, it's your total training volume per week that seems to be the number one driver of muscle growth. And there does seem to be a benefit to training each muscle at least twice a week. And that's in pretty much every study across the board usually shows some benefit to at least twice. Now, 3, 4, 5, we get into different debates for different people, depending on the type of training you're doing, where you're at. But everyone seems to benefit at least a little bit by training a muscle twice a week instead of once, even when the frequency, the volumes overall are the same for the week. But training volume is still the king. That is the number one determiner of how much muscle growth you stimulate per week. It seems to be the biggest factor, and that's based on his data and other people's. But yeah, frequency, actually higher frequencies do have an advantage. They do have an advantage. Up next, the hormone hypothesis. This is previous belief. Jacking up the post-exercise anabolic hormone response, testosterone, IGF-1, GH, is a primary driver of muscle growth. Well, that's been debunked about 3 years ago. Meta-analysis looked at that and determined that's not even true. That's a complete myth. Well, it was a hypothesis, but it wasn't a proven hypothesis. It wasn't supported by the data. It's been studied pretty heavily, quite a few studies. We've got meta-analysis. It doesn't matter. His current beliefs. If there is any benefit to post-exercise hormonal elevation, still highly equivocal, any effects would be modest at best. Right? In other words, we found that the amount of growth hormone or testosterone or whatever you release from training has no impact on the amount of muscle you gain. And I know that's an old theory. Sorry, Jerry Ward, because Jerry Ward, is running around saying, well, calf raises, standing heavy calf raises make your body release tons of growth hormone, therefore there's more growth. The data doesn't support it. Doesn't seem to be the case at all. The amount that you release doesn't matter. And again, it's because in the normal range, these hormones don't really do much different than it's slightly different levels. It's when people start putting exogenous amounts of these things in their body that you start seeing the real results. And you got to remember, those hormones released during and post-training are very transient. Although the one that did show the most promise was cortisol released during training seems to be correlated with muscle growth. But they don't know if it's the elevated cortisol or if it's just the fact that more effective training causes you to produce more cortisol because it's more stressful. In other words, training harder usually produces more muscle growth than not training hard. This is your layman's explanation for why that might be the case with cortisol. I don't think that one's too hard to figure out. Most people realize that if you train harder, you usually gain a little more muscle if you train hard than if you don't. That part's not rocket science. All right, this next one, the anabolic window of opportunity. He used to believe, this is a decade ago, consuming protein within an hour post-exercise is critical to maximizing the anabolic response to resistance training. Doesn't mean it was necessary, he just said it was for maximizing it. Now, current opinion, and I remember Alan Aragon's put out a lot of data on this over the years, debunking the anabolic window, and he does have a graduate degree in exercise science. The anabolic window is more of a barn door than narrow window, and its relevance ultimately depends on the timing of the pre-workout meal. Which is again, that was just, you could extrapolate that based on the data they had, because all those studies that showed a benefit on the post-workout shakes had people train completely fasted. Well, obviously, if you're fasted, nutrition becomes more critical, but he is right. What you eat before you train has an enormous impact on that anabolic window. And in fact, people who are really well fed and ate enough food, sometimes that they get the exact same growth response from a meal they eat 6 hours later after their training than they would have from the protein shake if pre-workout nutrition is sufficient. So it's an issue of balancing your pre and post-workout. That if you're fed well enough going into the training, that anabolic window can extend all the way out for like sometimes 6 or 8 hours, and you don't have to worry about fast absorbing. You can just eat a normal meal. It doesn't even have to be any sort of fast absorbing protein or carbs. So it totally changes based upon what you ate first. And he's right on that. And that's what the data shows. Then his last one was meal frequency. He previously believed eating small frequent meals is beneficial for fat loss. His current belief, the number of daily meals is largely irrelevant from a fat loss perspective, right? Largely irrelevant. Why? Because it's still about overall energy intake, energy balance. Of course, you got to remember people have gone the other direction now to where a ton of people think that fasting has fat loss benefits outside of caloric intake, and they used to believe that really high frequency meals, so eating at least 6 meals a day, had fat burning benefit. And this stuff just seems to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, right? Frequent feeding versus fasting. But the reality is it doesn't actually seem to matter. It doesn't seem to matter for fat loss. It's about total energy intake. That's what matters. And meal timing seems to be a strategy for diet adherence more than anything else. That's why some people see a benefit from intermittent fasting, and why some people see a benefit from really small, frequent meals. It has to do with how well does it control your individual appetite, and that could even vary with the type of foods you're eating in the person. And how does it affect your diet adherence? Are you more likely to eat your caloric deficit, or are you going to overeat with what you're doing? So, again, a lot of these things have changed, and these are just major points that if you go look at the previous ones, these are things that a lot of people still practice and believe. But then you got leading experts and researchers like Dr. Brad who are looking at it saying, no, this is stuff we believe might be the case, but, evidence has emerged that it's all not true, and these other things seem to be closer to reality when we start looking at multiple well-done studies looking at all these things. So he's just pointing out how over the last decade, exercise science, nutritional science, things like that have changed for athletes and everything else as we've developed better tools to study this stuff, better equipment to take measurements, more funding has come in. They found that things don't really work quite the way they thought that they did further back, now that we have the ability to test things better. So he's updated his ideas, and all his latter stuff in there, I actually tend to agree with all those changes that he made, and that's all stuff that I actually generally believe in also. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.